Well, howdy, everybody. This is Gail with episode 4 of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Today we're going to take a little bit of time and talk about my family that was with me all through the years when I was in West Virginia growing up. Now, I've lived in Lake Floyd, West Virginia, which is Salem, and there goes Piers again. Y'all gonna get to know him real well before this is over. And I lived in Philippi, West Virginia, as I've mentioned in prior broadcasts. And Philippi is a wonderful, wonderful little town. Now, while we lived in Philippi, we would often go to Clarksburg, which was maybe 25, 30 miles away from Philippi to the west. Clarksburg was a rather large town, and I remember several things about that town. One thing was we would go past a glass factory, a plate glass factory named Clearlight, and my mom's parents, Th.D and P.H. Nutter, Presley Hamilton Nutter, they lived in a place called Adamston when I first moved to West Virginia. And then they moved to a community called Eastview. And I remember Eastview very well. At the bottom of a hill was a Dairy Queen or Dairy Freeze or something like that. And you go up the hill and you turn left and go down a ways and you would see their house, which was a lovely house with a big porch. And right next to their house was a church. I believe it was at one time a EUB church, Evangelical United Brethren. Now, my grandfather, who my dad called PH, he was a coal miner all his life, and he retired. And I remember that I called him Grandpa, and he was very kind. He had a older car, I think it was a Comet, I'm not sure really, but he would load, when I'd stay overnight with him, he'd load me and Grandma and himself up in that car, and off we'd go to church. Now, the first church I remember him being at during those early years was a United Brethren church. And it was pastored by a pastor named Pringle. And I remember when he was preaching, man, he would just preach and preach and preach, and he wouldn't take a breath in between words. You know, it was something else. My grandfather at the time, P.H. Nutter, he was in charge of ringing the church bell in the bell tower to let everyone know that church is going to start. And then, a few years later, they went to a different church that was pastored by a man named Myers, I believe. And I remember it was in that church that I first heard the song, The Unclouded Day. And it was sung by the congregation, and I really enjoyed that. And every time I hear that song, I think of them going to that church. There were many times when we would come to Clarksburg and we would visit with family and friends and people like that. You know, we would go to my mom's sister's house where she and her husband Leonard were living with their two kids, Narda and Lynn. And I remember that house distinctly. And I remember you go in the house and go down a little hallway, and right there was Narda's room, and you turn right on the hallway a little bit, another hallway, and there was Lynn's room. And I remember one time we were there, and my mom and my dad were actually taking a sip of some type of whiskey or liquor or something like that. My mom's, said for years, no, we didn't do that. Well, I remember that. I really do. And I remember Uncle Leonard. He used to smoke cigarettes, and then he stopped smoking cigarettes, and sometimes he would tease me because I was in charge of carrying the diaper bag with bottles and things like that for Elena. And so, it was good-natured teasing. My Aunt Oreen, she worked for Sears for years and years, and I remember, she was just the greatest person in the world. And then my mom had two brothers, Uncle Marvin and Uncle Donnie. Now, Uncle Donnie and Uncle Marvin both were in the Navy. They were in the Navy Seabees, and that's what I was in, with the Seabees. One time, I remember we went to Gulfport, Mississippi, when Uncle Donnie was still active duty Navy, and I remember distinctly that he put me on a ride with him, and I got scared, and he had to take me off the ride, And I mentioned in an earlier video that I don't like rides at all. In fact, Mom put me on a scrambler ride one time. They had to stop the ride because I got so scared. I was bound and determined, she said, to jump out of that ride, and they had to stop it. But anyway, and Grandma lecturing at her, I remember their house in Eastview, and you go down some steps to the backyard, and they had this crabapple tree. And I remember Narda and I would get those crab apples sometimes. I can't remember if we ate them, and then you go in the house and go to the back of the house, and they had a sort of a balcony, and it was covered in some type of vines. It was like huckleberries or gooseberries or something like that. And Grandma, I remember in the house, she would bake bread, and a lot of loaves of bread from scratch. And, I remember she would slice that bread when it got cool, slap some butter on it, and give it to Grandpa and me for lunch. Now, she also made some tomato gravy, which I just could not stand. And to this day, I'm not going to be eating tomato gravy. In fact, I'm not crazy about tomatoes, except for ketchup and salsa and things like that. And we would have a great big Christmas. In fact, another sister named Rosalie, we called her Aunt Th.D, was married to a preacher, and Rosalie Davis. And his name was Morris Davis, Uncle Morris. And she was, well, let's say she was sort of bossy. And those of you that knew her, you know exactly what I'm talking about, And they adopted a son, Paul, who was a wonderful, wonderful man these days. I just love him. And then, there were all kinds of cousins. And, I had a bunch of cousins. There's Beverly, and she's grown now. Last time I saw her, she was a little girl, And it's amazing how people grow up. But when we were at Grandma's house for Christmas, everyone would show up, and we'd have the best times, and there'd be all kinds of pies and cakes and everything else there, and we'd eat in the dining room. Then we'd go in the living room. I remember had a fireplace, and it had hunter green tiles around it, and we would watch TV. And sometimes Walter Cronkite would come on, and he was talking about the Vietnam War. So that was That was really something else. You know, Narda and I, we grew up together, and we were constantly playing and teasing each other. And she is still the older, wiser, and better looking cousin than I was. I wasn't the best looking in the world, I don't believe. And Narda and I, we graduated in 1973, and our parents took us as graduation dinner out to eat, you know, and I'm not sure where that was. During this time, we would go to a place called Ellis Restaurant on a place called Bridgeport Hill. They had the only paved drive-in theater at the time, I believe. And then we'd go to another Ellis restaurant in Shinston, West Virginia, which just recently burnt down. I was so sorry to hear that. I would go in there with my parents. They'd order me a pizza. It was like a medium pizza for 88 cents. And sometimes we'd go to that movie theater and watch it. My dad knew all the owners of Ellis restaurants. When I would go to my grandma's house, one time we came up from Texas, and I had some horny toads in a box that I brought up from Texas. I tried to sell those things as baby dragons, but that didn't work out, and they died. And I buried those in Grandma's yard next to a tree. I'm not sure, you know, I believe it was on the west side of her house where I buried those. But the cousins, all the cousins and I, we had some good times during Christmas time and 4th of July times and the like. Some of us went to Cass Scenic Railroad, which is in Cass, West Virginia. It's an old locomotive that will take you in some old-timey train cars that are open cars up a mountain, and you get to the top, and there's picnic tables, and you can eat a picnic lunch and then come back down the mountain on the railroad. And at the same time, we go to a place called Blackwater Falls, which was sort of a brown water sometimes. I'm not sure why, but it was really a pretty place to go. So if you're ever in West Virginia, I'd encourage you to go see some of these places, the Cass Scenic Railroad and Blackwater Falls. And West Virginia is the most beautiful place on earth. John Denver was absolutely correct when he said almost heaven, West Virginia, because it really is. Many of us as a family would tease each other, but we really had some good times. Aunt Lois lived in Chicago, as I mentioned before. Sometimes she would come with her roommate, Edith, and they would come to Grandma's house, and they would always have gifts for everybody. And that was a big thrill. You knew when Aunt Lois was coming, you're going to get a present. My dad, he and Uncle Leonard sometimes would tease each other, and they really, I feel, loved each other. There was a time when we all got together and some pictures were taken. I wish I had some of those pictures to show you. If I've left anybody out today on the family, please, please, please let me know. Please forgive me, and I will mention you in another broadcast and some of the things we went through. My Uncle Donnie, he's married to Aunt Ruth, and Uncle Marvin is married to Aunt Debbie. I never spent too much time with them, but they are my aunts and uncles, and I love them all dearly. When my dad passed away, Uncle Donnie came to where my mom was in McKinney, Texas, and spent some time with her, and it was good to spend some time with him. It was a very sad occasion. It was totally unexpected when my dad passed away, and I believe that was in 2006. And I went to the funeral, and the thing that really touched me is a lot of my co-workers, including supervisors, went to that funeral to be a support to me. So that's a little bit about my West Virginia family. I mentioned J. Frank Peoples. He was a preacher up in the hills. I want to be careful what I say. Well, I'll just say it. It was kind of a hillbilly community where I became involved with the community and loved the people, and they loved me also. Oh, and I almost forgot. Marta should have reminded me of this. During that time, sometimes we would go to Clarksburg Baptist Church, and my dad was friends with the pastor there. Sometimes they would ask him to do the final prayer, and I was in the Boy Scouts, which met at that church too. In fact, at a later time, I became a Life Scout, which is right below Eagle Scout. And that's another story in itself. Anyway, back then I was involved with church youth groups, and there was this girl named Judy Swick. And she and I hooked up. She became my girlfriend. She was 4 years older than me, if I recall. And we would go on dates. Well, my parents would insist that they chaperone these dates. So what would happen was Judy Swick and I would sit in the back seat holding hands while my mom and dad, chaperoning us, would take us out to eat, then take Judy Swick back to her house, and there we go. I also remember during that time, speaking of Ellis Restaurant in Bridgeport, they had a waitress that my dad and mom got friendly with. Sometimes they would take her home. They allowed her, now get this, they allowed her to smoke inside their car. They really did. And I couldn't imagine such a thing. I grew up, I wasn't allowed to learn to dance. They told me why. They ain't no liquor. They ain't no cussing. They ain't no wild women. No, I'm not going to mention the Playboys that my dad had. That's another story. But he did have a box of Playboys. Now, let me explain this. He collected antique stuff and all kinds of stuff. And he had a collection of Playboy magazines. And one time they left me at home by myself. And I went in their bedroom and I got into this box of Playboy magazines. And then I put them back exactly like they were. And I don't think they ever guessed that I was looking at those Playboy magazines. You know, some of y'all never guessed I'd do that. But I sure did. And I don't know whatever happened in later years. In the 70s, my dad bought a case of Billy beer that was named after Billy Carter, President Jimmy Carter's brother. And my dad had all kinds of things that he would collect. There would be sometimes when we were living in Philippines, living on the college, that Grandma would actually come and visit with us and stay for a few days. Now, I might be wrong, but I believe when either Jonathan or Marcus, my brothers, were born, she was staying there helping take care of me and my dad. And she was my grandma. and Grandpa was my grandpa. And, Grandpa, one story that I'm going to tell y'all. As a kid, I would always say, well, what if? What if this happens? What if that happens? What if something goes wrong? What if we fall off a cliff? And Grandpa would always, when he'd see me, he'd say, what if, Gail? What if? What if? Some of y'all might remember that. But these are some great, great memories that I've had over the years. Narda, I've seen her over the years. There was a time when we hadn't seen each other in years and years. And something happened over those years. I got old. I really did. And, but Narda has 2 fine sons, and her husband passed away, and I was sorry to hear about that, but he was a great guy too. And so, let me say this. Uncle Morris, who was married to Aunt Th.D, he was a Baptist pastor, and we went to see him one time when he was pastoring in Virginia. And I just loved that man. I believe that he was a member of the Masons. I'm not sure about that. But Aunt Th.D, she was still the boss. Mom would always say Aunt Th.D would boss everybody around. She would take charge. And I've known several women like that. I won't go into my wife, because my wife sometimes, she can be bossy. She takes charge. But, sweetheart, I love you. And I didn't call you bossy. I just said sometimes you tend to guide me in the way that I should go. Well, guys, how's that about trying to get my foot out of my mouth? Anyway, I'm going to sit back today, enjoy my orange juice, and say I hope I see you all in episode 5. Come on back. We'll have a good time together. And this is Gail saying bye. God bless you richly, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye now.